Survival of the Greenest, Economic Transformation in a Climate-Conscious World by Amir Lebdwi. Let me briefly explain the dynamics of the presentation. First, I will offer you some information about the author. I will also dare to make some comments on the book. Then we will have the unofficial or unauthorized comments, as he himself claimed, by Dr. Boris Greisborg, the director of the lead program here at Colmex. And then we'll have the proper presentation of the book by the author. First of all, let me ask for your forgiveness because we don't have physical copies of the book yet. And the book will be digitally available, I believe, in May, according to the webpage. April? Perfect. So this is kind of a pre-presentation of the book, and we hope that we are able to pique your interest and before you have the chance to buy it and read it. Dr. Amir Lebdwi is an associate professor on the political economy of development at Oxford University. He obtained his PhD from Cambridge. He also published the book in Cambridge in the collection of Core in Development Economics. I am curious about which team do you support in the vote race. He is focused on industrial policy, climate change, economic transformation, and innovation. He has written in top-tier academic journals, and he has also worked with governments on green industrial policy strategies. He's Algerian, and if you read his work, you will see that he offers a very interesting perspective from the global south, which is very useful for Latin America and Mexico. The Survival of the Greenest is a book that reflects, in my opinion, two great virtues of Amir. On the one hand, it's a very short book and very easy to read. You can read the book in a day, and Amir is able to communicate these complex ideas in a very sophisticated way, but at the same time in a way that is very easy to be understood by anyone. But also the book is very well structured, is very well funded. You will find a lot of references on the latest research on green industrial policy. I was saying that the book can be read in a day, but also you can spend a whole year or more reviewing the references and discussing the arguments in the book. It reflects Amir's deep knowledge on green industrial policy. As I was saying, the book is an approach to this topic from the perspective of developing countries, and in that sense is very useful for Latin American researchers. Many of the examples that are mentioned in the book refer to Mexico and Latin America, also to Africa, if we have students from the Center of Asian and African Studies. When we talk about environmental policy from the perspective of developing countries, some may focus on the responsibility for this provision of a global public good, the mitigation and prevention of climate change. This is a goal that we face as humanity. But focusing on the responsibility of facing this public good may be tricky because most of the accumulated pollution has come from currently developed countries, accumulated during their industrialization processes based on carbon-producing fuels. But Amir focuses on different perspectives. For instance, the existing growth and development opportunities, the distributional effects, and the asymmetries in international trade regulation, among others. So he sees this green productive transformation as an opportunity instead of a cost. We have the opportunity to early adapt technologies that can lead ourselves to better adapt to these new market conditions. We could predict that in the near future there's going to be a greater demand for green products, and we may face a more strict international regulation regarding the production processes. I must admit that I particularly like the book for its unorthodox approach. Many times, due to the dominance of the mainstream, we have seen that the majority of the proposals regarding environmental policy focus on market mechanisms, mainly in prices. And Amir discusses the scope and limits of these mechanisms. I found it very interesting how he argues in favor of a more active role for the state, and how this is necessary in terms of the urgency of the challenge that humanity is facing. The book discusses industrial policy through the particular case of green industrial policy, and it does so in a very sophisticated way. It refers to market failures, and this is a reference to my students in microeconomics, but not only that. He also employs structuralist arguments, such as coordination failures. But he also criticizes overly simplistic approaches to industrial policy, such as imitation strategies, based on the differences between the countries that apply them. For example, how some of the policies that large countries with large demands have applied should not be imitated by small countries, and that regarding that some African countries have not been successful in doing so. So I told you that my introduction would be short, but let me end that with a quote from the book that does not only mention the environmental policy, but also is a reflection on Amir's heterodox approach to economics and on the value of qualitative research. I quote, "Economics as a discipline may inevitably fail the world on climate and development if the brightest minds are only incentivized to answer questions that have a quantifiable and methodologically complex and often obvious answer, rather than the difficult and even existential questions that may not allow for an answer that contains a precise number." Amir, congratulations on the book, and thanks a lot for coming to present it to the Colegio de México. So now let us continue with the comments by Dr. Boris Greisbord, director of the ELITE program.
I was going to start saying that I didn't have the time to read the book, but since my friend just said that you can read the book in 2 hours, I cannot say that. What I can say is that I went through the index, and I went to see how many pages Amir would take to discuss each issue that is reflected in the title of each chapter. And I thought that it would take me perhaps a whole semester or more, as you agree, to go through in a specific and attentive way all the ideas that you mentioned. So what I'm going to do, I see students from Center for Economic Studies, Centro de Estudios Económicos. I don't see any students, anybody in the audience interested in environment, just like that. So I am going to, in fact, since we are transmitting this presentation, I'm going to talk to my colleagues, to the environmentally interested audience that will be probably listening to this presentation. Especially because I opened the book and I absolutely agree with Darwin's quote by Amir, and So the first thing I did is to write, I agree with Amir in his chosen epigraph. And I want to mention it. The species that survives is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. Charles Darwin. So I am going to propose an epigraph by Amir, which I took from the first and the last paragraph of the last chapter. The first paragraph, page 62, and the last paragraph, page 65. Reimagining development is no easy thing. And then the other part, the path to greening economic development is paved with hurdles and complexities that demand an unparalleled level of political dedication at local, national, and global levels. Part of these ideas are treated and are developed in the chapters. I also thought that the idea of involving or asking for a much more intense and direct intervention by the state would be necessary and absolutely essential to go through these ideas of implementing a green industrial policies. A rapid tour through the book allowed me to understand that the path to decarbonization and simultaneous efforts to greening will lead to an increase of already enormous economic disparities between countries. This is an interesting point because you have to go through not only green industrial policy, you have to go through the impact in the context in which you are trying to implement the policies. And that's a very important thing, and that's usually omitted by public policy, by trying to implement, starting with design of the policy, implementing, monitoring, retrofitting, et cetera, no? So I thought it is a very important thing to take notice of. But what is interesting and drives you to keep reading, it is Amir's optimism in his effort to find and describe consistent and substantive conditions to be followed by development, post-industrial, developing, and underdeveloped economies in order to adjust and take advantage of what he terms the new dynamics of structural transformation induced by climate change. We are facing a context in which we cannot avoid. This is the main idea of trying to develop a green industrial policy, I would guess. This task, he insists, is unavoidable in order to confront the difference between a planet that's still suitable for humans to live on and one that is not. That's a I don't know if that's optimism or not. This is a fundamental statement, and we should we do not understand as Anthony Giddens' book, more or less old book, The Politics of Climate Change. He made he interviewed people in England, and he then classified them in 7 classes, and the most agreeable, amicable, friendly group would say, well, I do enough. See? So the idea of a planet that is suitable for humans to live on and one that is not is a tremendous gap, but it's difficult to understand and to assimilate. The formula to my understanding, I'm not an economist, is simple. Replace fossil fuels with clean energy. I would say renewables, not only clean, but renewables, and avoid unsustainable overconsumption. Easy to write on. But the process offers some, as far as I understand, and I'm not pessimistic, very difficult problems to overcome, barriers of different kind. The most important, to my understanding, are related to institutional development and to reach a concerted agreement across national interests to coordinate a process to ensure economic prosperity and sustain livelihoods while decarbonizing our planet. It is implicit the timing that is necessary to implement and to reach this difficult agreement, because there is no governance, there's no government, there's no global world governance. And the point here, the other point here is the interdependence of initiatives in one economy to the other economies, or to the rest of the world global economy. Decarbonizing our planet in what are, on the one hand, the imminent climate risk, and on the other, parallel transition risks. There are two important risks there. The one that is related to the one we are facing, the context in which we are operating, and the other one is the impact that we are going to create in terms of the transitional process. I cannot present here a thorough review and go through in detail of the pertinent and timely book. I opted for a comfortable way to comply with the task of taking about the survival of the greenest, a climate-conscious world in which we are all live. I left for the official comments by him to go through the substantive things. What I will do is I just follow the issues treated in the 7 chapters, as described by the author, to finish highlighting the question Amir is proposing to answer. Perhaps the audience could ask him to synthesize some answers if we have time. But we will have time until we have the book materially, physically. Chapter 1 follows an argument. It's a sort of a textual quote, but it's also a little bit free to think about the chapters that you describe at the more or less at the beginning of the book. No, chapter 1 follows an argument in reviewing conventional knowledge and values. Pollute now, clean later. Industrialization is dead, so don't worry. Services are free of pollution. Follow previously successful industrializing trajectories, paths, industrializing paths, or what he terms isomorphic mimicry. Though it's incredible the barriers that these myths and ideas put on. No, chapter 2 and 3. So I stay in chapter 1, and I thought I'm gonna take one semester to try to develop all these the implications of all these mimics, all these isomorphic mimics. No. Chapter 2 and 3 are focusing on the efforts in exports, revenues, jobs, and innovations while confronting climate risk and transition risk. And there's the interdependence, the global interdependence of each decision-making in one economy and the other, and then trickle down, but also on the other hand, bottom up. Also interdependencies on the top down and bottom up. Chapter 3 deals with the burden poorest nation will face based on economic disparities in the process of global decarbonization in a context in which the past will not work today. I'm facing the dilemma of abandoning business as usual and entering and adopting a new paradigm, given also the fact that low carbon technologies have been captured by a handful of industrialized economies and corporations. Chapter 4 emphasizes the role of industrial policy and factors of success at the same time of facing constraints and institutional requirements in order to respond to local circumstances. I won't insist on that. I will take another semester in terms of looking at the institutional requirements. Chapter 5 illustrates the advantage of accepting and identifying the varieties of possible transforming pathways. The author offers examples of climate-smart agriculture in traditional Arab land regions and nature-based services in biodiverse regions. That's an interesting thing. But Amir refers to Uruguay. Uruguay is different a little bit. Just imagine, no? Uruguay is an interesting example of how institutional development will provide with the possibilities of eliminating barriers and adopting conditions in order to go on, no? In that sense, Uruguay is a good example. But it's not a good example in terms of the Latin America. It's difficult, no? Especially in terms of institutional development. I like the idea of social innovations as well as technological innovations in different sectors. Examples of those, I think, taking advantage of Toño Yunes being here, I have to mention that he's interested in exploring the possibilities of technological innovations in the primary sector, in agriculture, et cetera, in the context of climate change and all that sort of. Chapter 6 explores some international obstacles to implement the new paradigm, green economic transformation, such as market protectionism, financing, and in general, imposing national interest in leading economies. I'm taking too long. I thought I practiced, and it took only 4 minutes, and I said, that's too little. I have to introduce some extras.
That's very good, because then I don't have to present.
Finally, Chapter 7 is an excellent overview of current issues based on the prevailing industrialization paradigm that has to be replaced as there is no other option. That's the point here. Let me finish by reproducing the question posited by the author in page 6 and intended to be answered throughout the chapters in this obligatory reading by all who need to clarify sustainable development pathways. The questions in English and my Spanish translation, I will read them. I think I will read them in Spanish because it's important for my environmentally interested audience. Los países en desarrollo, no habiendo utilizado su parte de las emisiones de carbono a la atmósfera, es la discusión global, ¿sí? Reclaman su derecho a contaminar, ¿sí? A ver, bájale, porque yo tengo derecho a subirle, etcétera, etcétera. Pero será el curso óptimo para sus poblaciones. Ahí entra Amir en la discusión de París y de Tokio y de Agenda 2020, de todo, ¿no? Ahí está la cosa. ¿Es el desarrollo industrial la mejor ruta para reducir la pobreza? Y si así fuera, ¿qué tipo de modelo puede ayudar a reconciliar industrialización y sustentabilidad? Ese es el otro aspecto, ese es parte del mito, la trayectoria, la inercia de vamos a industrializar porque vamos a crear empleo. ¿Es la manufactura baja en carbono el único camino a una transformación económica verde? Y ahí hay interdependencias también intersectoriales, entre sector primario, todo, ¿no? Incluso servicios, etcétera. Para los que llegaron tarde, ¿es la industrialización verde una mejor y más justa ruta para ponerse al corriente en el modelo de industrialización convencional? ¿Qué instrumentos de política pueden ayudar a los países a llegar, entre comillas, especialmente aquellos con limitadas capacidades preexistentes? Ese es el otro problema, ¿no? Las capacidades. Bueno, institutional development, capacity building, todo. ¿En dónde puede una política industrial verde tener resultados positivos y qué factores pueden influir en un resultado exitoso? Y una última, ¿están los sistemas de financiamiento y comercio internacional apoyando una transición justa o están exacerbando las disparidades en términos de acceso a oportunidades económicas verdes en naciones ricas y pobres? Bueno, nada más. Nada más. Me permití, I allow myself to write about this, take time in repeating the questions, because just for curiosity, you have to read your book. They have to read your book for curiosity. Only the decision makers, though, they have to read the book just for curiosity. So thank you.
No, thank you very much, Julian, Boris, for those introductions and for this very, you're making my task much easier to present the book. And thank you for hosting me for this very first presentation of the book, because it's only coming out as an ebook next month and as a print version in May. You said out of curiosity to read the book. I think the more important argument to read the book is that it's going to be free. So if you don't like it and you don't find the answers, then you didn't waste money at least. So how long would you like me to?
We have 34 minutes. We have the online transmission till 12:30, so you have enough
Okay,
time.
and then half an hour for discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to be brief, and I might jump some sections so that we can have this discussion. So, in nature, biological organisms adapt and survive and thrive mostly by adjusting, right, to the changes in their environment. And in many ways, of course, it applies to us as a human species, but it also applies to, well, us as economists, but also in terms of economic policy, right, in terms of adapting to changing policy environments, to new trends, technological disruptions. And climate change is obviously one of the biggest disruptions that the world is facing. So how do we adapt to this? Now, when it comes to climate change, and maybe some of you will disagree, but it seems that, as you highlighted, we know what we need to do to solve climate change. I mean, it's not actually that difficult, no? We know that we have to phase out fossil fuels, replace it with clean energies, reduce overconsumption to also reduce the material footprint. So we kind of know what are the actions that need to be taken, right, to reach a Paris Agreement compatible scenario. What we really don't know, though, is how to achieve climate goals while sustaining local livelihoods and while promoting economic development at the same time. And this is also why many policymakers find it so much more tempting to pursue the kind of short-term, growth maximization pathway as opposed to, and delay greening, as opposed to trying to find this kind of, agenda that really aligns both worlds. So this was the main argument, the main motivation for the book was to kind of bring this environmental perspectives to economists and developing economists particularly, but also bring this industrial perspective to the environmentalist discussion. Talking about the survival, right, of the greenest. One example that I like to use is from this island, Nauru. Have you ever heard about Nauru? No, not so much. So Nauru is this island very far from here in the middle of the Pacific. It used to be one of the wealthiest nations in the world in terms of income per capita in the 1970s, right? So in 1970s, it already had an income per capita of $27,000. And this was mostly thanks to the extraction of its rich phosphate deposits, the guano. But the inevitable happened. Few decades later, they extracted all the phosphate that they had. But in the process of extraction, it was done in an environmentally damaging way, which destroyed the arable land, and agriculture used to be the main source of livelihoods for these local populations for centuries before. And then the country went into a deep economic crisis at the verge of bankruptcy. And now, and that might be the one reason why you may hear about Nauru in the news, is that the main source of income for the government is that they're using the island as a refugee detention center on behalf of Australia. So this shows, this is a horror story of economic development. No, and the reason why I bring this up is because this is not an isolated experience. This is a cautionary tale. This is something that happens throughout times, and it can easily happen to many other countries. I was really shocked when I arrived in Mexico to hear that there's about 13 years of oil production left with existing production, not taking into account possible reserves. That's cutting it very, very short. It's literally living on the edge of basically your long-term economic survival. But the case of Nauru, what this also shows us is that present choices, because that decision, right, to embark in this model was taken at the very early stages of deciding to extract the phosphate. And then what was the value of that phosphate, right? Because actually you can make the case that this phosphate had a negative value because of the loss of opportunity income in agriculture, which is renewable, no? So they might have made several $billion in phosphate extraction, but actually in real terms, it must have been negative because now they cannot grow anything on the island anymore. So how do we see the value of these extractive resources? But at the time that they embarked on this decision, right, it's already too late. So that shows that present choices also inform future production possibilities. And I think that really calls our attention today to think, what are the pathways that for long-term economic transformation and in land sustainability, and which are the pathways that might be more appealing today, but that will really lock us in a non-viable carbon-intensive pathway. So I was going to mention 4 things in particular regarding first the new conditions for economic development and the urgency of green structural transformation. Oh yeah, my slides are in Spanish, but I'll speak in English. 2 is the inequality between, in terms of who gets to capture the industrial benefits of global decarbonization. 3, the role of the state as what I call it, as a head coach. And lastly, the challenges and success factors in the different contexts, right? There are many ways to do green industrial policy, and there's no need to just imitate what other countries do. So I think Boris highlighted it in terms of the climate risks, right, and transition risks, which disproportionately affect developing countries. And that's because these countries tend to depend a lot more on things like agriculture, tourism as a source of livelihoods, and those sectors are particularly vulnerable to fluctuations in temperature, in precipitation, but also in extreme meteorological shocks, right? And I think here in Mexico, if I understand correctly, you've already experienced quite a lot of this in the past few years, right? Droughts, hurricanes that have affected touristic areas that a lot of people depend on us for their jobs, that have impacted the corn production and so on. Transition risks as well. As you can see from this map, the countries in blue, these are the countries that overly depend on fossil fuels for exports. As the global decarbonization agenda advances, what are these countries going to do in terms of their export engines, right? Their main way of generating foreign exchange. And these countries are penalized twice because credit rating agencies are increasingly taking into account those transition and climate risks in their riesgo país, which means that, you know, the cost of borrowing for these countries will even be even higher, right? So it's estimated that for every $10 of interest payment, not in total payment, but just the interest by developing countries, an additional $1 will be spent due to climate vulnerability, right? So in this context, there is also an opportunity that comes out from green economic transformation. There are the so-called green windows of opportunities that emerge for industrialization. A lot of standard routes to industrialization are already blocked because of intense competition, particularly from China. But in the context of green industries, there's still new entrants. In some of the sectors, there's still room for disruption. So this could be a new entry door for developing countries. And this concept of green windows of opportunity is done, has been developed by the fantastic work of the Venezuelan scholar Carlota Perez, which has been working on technological revolutions for like 5 decades, and Lehman and his co-authors. The case for the kind of early greening also stems from the fact that clean energy transitions are key for the 4th industrial revolution. A lot of people are talking about blockchains, big data, artificial intelligence, and whatnot, things that I don't understand. But what I know is that those things are highly energy intensive, right? The ICT sector, so information and communication and technologies, it's basically its share of global greenhouse gas emissions, it's larger than that of the aviation sector. So as we move on into the future, the ability to have access to clean and cheap energy sources will be key to pursue a state-of-the-art industrialization. And lastly, the concept of environmental upgrading is particularly relevant because there's a new source of adding value to your products and to your firms, which is by pursuing environmental measures, either by process upgrading. So this is when you improve your resource efficiency in production, right? So you lower your costs, for example, by reusing material or using less energy. 2 is by product upgrading. So when your product is more durable, can be easily repaired, recycled, so you can charge a premium for it. And 3 is the intersectoral upgrading. This is the Uruguay example that Boris had mentioned. It's when you can actually diversify and enter new value chains by pursuing environmental measures. And for example, in Uruguay, what has happened in dairy farms is that they start to reuse basically the waste, so cow excrements, as a source of biofuel production. And in some farms now, the main source of revenues comes from biofuel production, not even milk production, right? So this is a way to actually add value to the production and actually diversify, but through environmental measures. So for these reasons, it's important to go beyond the logic of grow now, clean up later, because there are a lot of benefits from early greening, but also a lot of risks from delaying greening, right? So being locked in a carbon-intensive pathways. So we posited that early greening is great, there are green windows of opportunity, and so on. Very often, you hear in public debates or in academic debates that, kind of when you go green, it will be more inclusive, and this is a chance for the global south, and so on. But actually, when you look at the data, the picture is a bit more concerning. Because in terms of jobs, for example, right, jobs around renewable energy sectors, you see that it's highly concentrated in a handful of already industrialized large economies. So basically, half of jobs in renewables are in China, right? And the rest are Europe, USA, and also Brazil and India to some extent. In Africa, for example, it's about 2% of jobs in renewable energy sectors, right? It's peanuts. In addition, what you see from this map, in red are the countries that highly depend on fossil fuel exports as a source of foreign exchange and revenues. And you can see that this is not where the jobs are being created in renewables, right? So of course we know that there are more jobs created in renewables, which offsets the loss of jobs in fossil fuel sectors. But the problem is this is not happening in the same geographies. And this is a great source of concern. So this was the job story, but if you look at exports of low carbon technology products, I think most of you here, you know that the capacity to export is key for economic development. At least this is an insight from the structuralist school. And here the picture is even more concentrated. 3 countries, China, Germany, and the USA, account for half of low carbon technology exports globally. And this is a race. You see the rise of China here is incredible. From the practically nothing in the early 2000s, now it's completely dominating the sector. But that also shows that it's very difficult to find a space in this world, and especially in context of green technologies. A nice, on the financing side of things, a statistic that I like. Actually, I hate the statistics, but I find it interesting. So regions like Africa, Latin America, we know that these are regions where you could produce, that have the highest potential for solar energy production, for wind energy production, for hydrogen production. Veronica, who's part of the team in the Green Economic Transformation for Latin America, worked on Chile's hydrogen strategy, so she knows quite a bit about this. And this is also, especially in Africa, where people still really lack access to energy, right? There are 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that don't have access to energy. So if you put those two things together, it would make sense for most of the investments in renewable energy production to go to those areas, right? Now, in recent years, in terms of renewable energy investment per capita, for US and Canada, it's about $180 per capita, right, of renewable energy investment. I think in Europe it's about 120, in Japan it's about 140. What do you think is the value for Latin America? And what do you think the value is for Africa? Knowing that this is where you have a much higher potential for renewable energy production and a much higher need. Venture a guess.
20 cents.
20 cents, oof. You on the front row, since you have the...
Go ahead.
50? Close. So the number is actually 31 for Latin America and $1 for Africa, right? So basically there's no money going into renewable energy production in Africa. And this graph shows you a lot about what you need to know about the uneven financing landscape for not only renewable energy production, but as a result, the whole panorama for green industrialization, at least the part of it that depends on access to renewable energy, right? Because for some of those sectors, forget about it if you don't have access to clean and cheap energy. So in terms of comparative advantage, right, this is a map showing existing comparative advantage in low carbon technology sectors, and what is really striking is, it's a handful of mostly rich industrialized nations. Mexico is there, but the rest of the global south is not, as things stand, is not poised to benefit from this kind of green windows of opportunity. But rather than taking this statistic or these existing comparative advantages as a given, what this shows is maybe we need to go beyond the orthodox mainstream interpretations of static comparative advantage, but move towards the more heterodox understanding of the dynamic acquisition of comparative advantages, right? Which take into account the process of learning by doing, industrial policy, the role of the state to acquire specific comparative advantages on the long term. So Toyota, for example, I mean, what makes Denmark better than others at producing wind turbines? Are they naturally better? Should you just accept that that they'll beat others at doing it? What about the Chinese at producing solar cells? In terms of automotive production, the Japanese are actually, Toyota is one of the most competitive companies in the world, but it took Toyota 40 years to become profitable. 40 years in which it was running at loss and subsidized by the Japanese government. But what was the difference there is that they had this process of learning by doing, incremental upgrading, which enabled to acquire this comparative advantage in car manufacturing on the long term. So this is a lesson that perhaps we can learn from the past and apply in the context of green industries. Another example that I like is from Malaysia. If you look at, Malaysia today is one of the largest exporter of electronics products, especially in the small island in Malaysia called Penang, which is often referred to as the Silicon Valley of the East. And it all started with an investment from Intel. And at the time, when you read mainstream economist account of the Malaysian economy, it says, oh, those things are far outside of their comparative advantage, right? No, Malaysians are never going to be producing computers. And the first investment that put Malaysia kind of on the track, right, to become a hub for electronics first assembly was an investment from the Intel Corporation. But this picture, and I love it, is a picture of Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel at the time, invited by the Malaysian government to come visit, right, the space and invite them to invest, no? If you notice well, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but he has no shoes. Because when he arrived, it had rained the day before, so it was basically a rice plantation, it was a rice field, and it became completely muddy. So the other picture is his car that got completely stuck and they could not even progress. So for any, one that sticks to a kind of comparative advantage logic, no way that they would invest, right, in a computer assembly factory in the middle of a literally rice plantation in Malaysia, which had no experience in this area. But what actually attracted this investment, I think it's useful in the context of Mexico today and the whole discussion on nearshoring and attracting the right type of investment. What convinced Intel was this kind of like long-term vision of the Malaysian government, the simultaneous investments they were doing in trainings for in electronics assembly for local workers, the infrastructure spending that they had around this area, and that convinced Intel to invest it. And today, Penang is the success that we know today. But at the time, this was definitely not within Malaysia's comparative advantage. So in this context, we also need to redefine the role of the state. By redefine, I mean there's a lot of people that's been writing about the role of the state, right? And that means a state that is a lot more present, that is a lot more interventionist, but in a smart and coherent way. This is not the same as just protectionism, right? But this is, I like the metaphor that I like is the one from sports. So the state not just as a referee, but as the head coach. Not necessarily as a player, as the captain of the team, but as the head coach, which means they don't necessarily have to play in the game. But the state, even if it just sets the vision, the training, understands the chemistry between the different players, aka the firms, that can do a lot in actually increasing the competitiveness of the team and actually compete in international competitions, right? And if you leave players without the head coach, there's no way that they can actually upgrade and fight this race. So this also means that market-based solutions to solving climate change and promoting green industrialization are not enough. And what is also striking is this is still the mainstream thinking around, green economic transformation. And as an example, William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel laureate in economics in 2003 he won it, I forgot, wrote that raising the price of carbon is a necessary and sufficient step to tackle global warming. The rest is fluff. And then there's another economist, Weitzman, who wrote, high carbon prices would do more to unleash the decentralized power of capitalistic he's American, inventive genius on the problem of researching, developing, and finally investing in economically efficient carbon-avoiding alternative technologies than all of the piecemeal command and control standards and patchwork subsidies making it around in Washington those days. So this is really still the kind of widespread economic understanding of green economic transformation. And this is really an issue for many reasons, right? Because first, there's no evidence that carbon taxes are enough. Two, there's no evidence that this actually doesn't increase inequalities, that it helps balancing the local development needs. And four, in many ways, it also enables for some firms to buy the right to pollute, right? And to just pay the price, but that doesn't really solve global warming. Which brings us to the role of industrial policy, right? As a key strategic intervention of the role of the state to promote economic transformation. And the reason why we talk about industrial policy is not from ideological fanatism, no? It's what the evidence shows us. If you speak to people that are against industrial policy, ask them in which country has actually managed to acquire new comparative advantages, diversify, escape the middle income trap, without an industrial policy in particular sectors. It's pretty hard to find. And that actually was the motivation for my work in Chile, which was this kind of like laissez-faire example, a model of free market economics that actually worked with the emergence of new sectors. But even in Chile, there are so many industrial policies in disguise, even during the dictatorship of Pinochet, which was arguably the kind of Chicago Boys logic. Some of those interventions were more extreme and interventionist than industrial policy in left-leaning governments, no? In the forestry sector, the central bank directly subsidized the plantation of a particular type of tree that they had identified as having the right conditions for Chile, and then had this kind of basically an export ban on on raw wood exports, right? And the idea was to stimulate local transformation. And now industrial policy is knowing an incredible and unexpected survival in popularity, but mostly kind of through the green agenda, right? From a much better understanding from recent literature that industrial policy is also important to tackle climate change, right? And which requires a change in productive structures, but also from a geostrategic interest. And you can see it from the United States. For them is they've realized that China has been doing green industrial policy for the past 20 years and it worked. And now the US is actually in a position of trying to catch up with China, right? And that kind of has motivated the need for industrial policy to achieve perhaps faster what would be achieved with a carbon tax. Now, in terms of the political economy of green industrial policy, there is the technical aspect of it, but it's important to acknowledge that it's really conditioned. The ways in which governments choose to pursue industrial policy, the exact objectives, the type of instruments that they favor over another, this is deeply rooted in local political economy contexts, the strength of social coalitions between different groups, state capacity. And that really explains, for example, why in a country like China, they were able to be a lot more aggressive, ambitious with the kind of instruments that they use, using a lot state-owned banks as well to finance this program in comparison to a country like Brazil, where the approach was a lot softer, right? A lot more amenable to private capital, because the first Lula administration and the Dilma Rousseff administration, they had less, let's say, autonomy from particular private sector groups. Which is why, for example, in Brazil, the main industrial policy that had worked was subsidized loans from the Brazilian Development Bank, BNDES, right? So this was below market rates, while providing incentive for local contents in wind energy projects, right? So this was not kind of forcing or disciplining private capital into going into this field. It also explains why in the United States, a lot of the new industrial policy is through the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. No, it's tax handouts, essentially to firms. But that's because of the complex political layout of the US, where the IRS is perhaps one of the few institutions that can be kind of more under the influence of the White House. But for other kind of instruments, it would be very difficult to pass it through Congress. And in the EU, they haven't really managed to have a coherent, besides the discourse, they haven't really managed to put a serious green industrial policy on the table, but that's mostly because of the difficulty of getting all the member states to agree, and some member states want to kind of go on it alone, especially Germany. On the kind of different sides of industrial policy, there is this important discussion between escorting versus disciplining industrial policy. A lot of the revival of industrial policy has been mostly one in which governments have escorted private capital, right, going towards particular areas, mostly with tax handouts, incentives, but a lot of carrots, but very little stick, right? And the issue with this is that, as a result, very often, this has high risks of elite enrichment, right, at the expense of labor. I think the maquiladora model in Mexico shows that quite well, and there is a risk to have this reproduction of this model as well in green industries. There is also a danger if green industrial policies are not coordinated with social and education policies, that most of the job opportunities for skilled job opportunities and highly paid job opportunities will only benefit kind of the limited groups of already skilled workers whose wages are going to disproportionately increase compared to low skilled workers. And that would happen if you don't coordinate with upskilling of low income groups so that they benefit from the industrial policy drive and the labor demand that comes out of it. And this is what happened in Costa Rica, where the export sophistication was very successful, but it actually increased inequalities between the skilled workers in the center of the country and the less skilled workers in the coastal areas. So the state needs to play this kind of double role of accompanying, but also disciplining private capital towards these areas that show long-term prospects for growth. There's also different planification and kind of capabilities that are required with green industrial policies, which cannot just be the mandate of a Ministry of Industry or Trade, because green industrial policy cuts across energy policy, environmental policy, innovation, skills development policy, especially as you can use environmental regulations, for example, very strategically to promote particular products in which the country has a vested industrial interest, but also has an import constraint, and that's what the European Union has done quite a lot, right? The EU's environmental regulations in many ways reflect the kind of sectors that they want to promote and the sectors that they don't want to, the products that they don't want to import. In terms of this coordination, there are many different institutional layouts that countries have used. This coordination between different ministries. In Malaysia, for example, this has been the role of the Economic Planning Unit that sits in the Prime Minister's office. In China, quite interestingly, they actually completely eliminated the Ministry of Energy for that reason, because they thought that decisions around energy are completely cross-ministerial, that having that ministry made it very difficult to not work at cross-purpose, so that they completely eliminated it and replaced it with a National Energy Commission, which actually has a kind of cross-ministerial outlook. I'm not saying this is the way, I'm just saying this is an interesting example. And now, the issue of isomorphic mimicry, which, by the way, I didn't come up with a term. It's Matt Andrews, Len Pritchett at Harvard that have kind of invented the word to describe this tendency by governments to just imitate or replicate the institutions in other governments that are more successful, right? But they kind of reuse the same institutions without the actual content, right? And when it comes to green industrial policy, it's very important to know that it has to be adapted to the local context, right? There are some solutions that work around the globe, but there are many different ways to do it, and even at the local level in different regions of a particular country. So, for example, and it's not all about low carbon manufacturing. It's a big part of it, but it doesn't have to be. And by the way, not everybody can engage in low carbon manufacturing. If you're Guatemala, if you're Togo, it's going to be very difficult to enter the race for wind turbine manufacturing, and perhaps you shouldn't, Perhaps it's really way outside of your efficiency frontier. But the point is, there are many other ways to do green industrial policy. So, for example, in areas which have access to arable land or agro-based economies, climate-smart agriculture shows a lot of prospects for technological sophistication, linkages with different industrial sectors. The experience of Brazil is particularly interesting, even though this was also a case of elite enrichment. Two, in the context of fossil fuel producing regions, there are a lot of capabilities, technological capabilities, infrastructure skills that can be repurposed from the fossil fuel sectors towards clean energy supply chains. Biodiverse areas. If you have a biodiverse area, right, you're not going to, if you destroy the forest and replace it with a solar panel factory, that's not really green industrialization. That's not very sustainable. But there are other ways to leverage the innovation value of nature. And lastly, for small nations, for latecomers. Many of the examples of green industrial policy comes from very large economies that heavily rely on demand-side policies, local demand-side policies. But if you're a small country, you don't have access to such large demand, right? So how do you address those issues? So I just wanted to briefly go into two of those, maybe the biomimicry one and the small nation dilemma, as perhaps more relevant to the case of Mexico. So you see this bird, no? It's the famous colibri, what strikes you about the value of this bird, the innovation value of this bird? Do some of you have an engineering background or no? You? A little bit. So what do you see about this bird that might attract your attention? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah, you clearly have an engineering background. So the way it flies, the hummingbird is able to fly in ways that human designed drones cannot, right? Because of the kinetic structure of its exoskeleton, it can actually fly in 4 different directions. It can completely stabilize, and in its neck, but the head being completely stable. And the shape of its beak is completely aerodynamic. So this was actually the source of inspiration, well, not exactly the colibri, but the kingfisher, for the Japanese bullet trains, right, which had an engineering problem when it was coming out of tunnels. And it's actually Japanese scientists had the idea to model the front of the train after the beak of the kingfisher, right, because of the aerodynamic shape of it. And that's how they managed to solve the issue. And same with the colibri and the way it flies. The biggest sponsor, financial backer of biomimicry research in the world is the US Department of Defense, which are pouring a lot of money for grants to design drones that can learn from hummingbirds in terms of being able to fly in 4 different dimensions. So what these examples show is that nature has, of course, an ecological value, but also has a great source of value as a source of information for innovation, right, and R&D. And that field of biodiversity-based innovation has very large economic impacts, and with prospects of increasing productivity and jobs in various sectors, from construction, transportation, electronics, plastics production, energy generation and storage. And of course, a country like yours that is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, right, has a huge potential to tap into this existing biodiversity to move into innovation activities. But this has not happened, and mostly because of a lack of innovation and industrial policy, a lot of coordination failures that exist, from financial support for biomimicry research, for developing the kind of skills that you need for biodiversity-based innovation, which require strategic mix of engineering skills, but also chemistry, biology, design. Talking about design, where is it Dira? Yeah. I'm actually amazed by the design capabilities in Mexico, including for the design of this poster, which is much better than the book cover. And intra-industry linkages, right, to promote. And without this, just with falling market forces, this innovation value of Mexican biodiversity has been completely captured by firms in the United States, Japan, South Korea, Germany. You're basically providing them free R&D inputs, right, as a source of information. And lastly, small countries. So I mentioned they don't have the local demand, the existing capabilities that China has, that the US has. So how can they address those issues? And there I see 2 options. The first one is what Mexico has been doing. So market piggybacking, right, to which the window of opportunity that is a bit too high. And the issue with this strategy is that if you overly rely on one market of a neighbor, can really increase your vulnerabilities if there is a shock in that economy or a radical government change with different priorities and different types of regulations and incentives, which I guess can easily happen at the end of the year in the United States. To that external demand from the United States might not really coincide with the domestic developmental priorities and ecological needs of Mexico, right? So that kind of puts you in a passenger seat, but not in the driver's seat of where you actually want to go. So thinking about a Nauru case again. The second option is getting a leg up to reach the windows of opportunity with regional cooperation. And this is where the multilateral coordination of green industrial policy is particularly important, even in a country like Mexico, where with other countries. They can be cooperation not only to reach economies of scale for particular products, if you actually align demand-side policies and regulations, cross-border management or management of cross-border environmental assets, stabilize demand for particular goods because you would have the same demand across different markets, so that would give investor trust to invest in particular projects where they see long-term market opportunities, and build an alternative or complementary regional supply chain to not overly depend on one type of supply chains. So I'll just end it there. The main message is that the conditions for economic development are changing, and if we follow the survival of the greenest logic, then public policies must adapt accordingly. Industrialization is dead. Long live industrialization, but based on new principles of durability, of dematerialization, of decarbonization. But industrial policy remains as relevant as ever, and the role of the state is as relevant as ever. There are many different starting points and pathways. And lastly, I focused the presentation, given the time, at the policies at the national level. But there is also still a limit to what can be done at the national level without ambitious reforms of the international trade and financial architecture, right, to enable more financing for green industrialization in the global south, but also to rethink global trade rules. We still overly favor rich nations at the expense of developing nations that want to pursue some of those tools. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion and the debate. And as I mentioned, the book is coming out April 25 as a free ebook. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. I guess that we have like 15, 20 minutes for questions from the audience. I will share with you the microphone because otherwise questions are not heard in the on the YouTube transmission. Any questions?
Hello, I'm Olinka. I'm a student. I'm his student actually from the microeconomics course, and I'm an economics student. And all of a lot of the proposals were directed towards transitioning away from fossil fuels, and there's certainly I feel like in when talking about green transition, there's a lot of focus on carbon emissions. But other essential resources that pose an existential threat as well, water, for example. Mexico City has a drought currently, so it's especially relevant. But land sustainability, air quality, all of these other factors, are they also taken into account when thinking about industrial policy? So they feel they're being kind of left out.
Should we take a round of questions?
Three questions.
Yeah, maybe. Go ahead. Yeah, share with.
Hello. I would like to ask you if you are against markets for pollution fees, or if you think it's an insufficient way to encourage green development. That's just.
Thanks, Amir, for your presentation. So you focused a lot, you said there's two things we need to do to solve climate change. One, switch to green energy, and the second is end overconsumption. And you didn't really say anything about the overconsumption issue and solutions. So I'm really curious to know what counts as overconsumption of electric cars, overconsumption of flights, all of these things, and how does that square with pursuing all of this broadly within a capitalist framework? Because I thought that maybe the extension of markets, encouraging and expanding consumption is something fundamental to that. So if you could talk a bit more about that, I'd be interested.
Go ahead. Now, these are very good questions. The first one, and I'll connect it to the last one on the different challenges beyond greenhouse gas emissions. So one in the book, and there is a focus on the energy side, but there is a clear acknowledgement that actually decarbonization is one of the many ecological challenges that we need to face, right? And it's not just about the carbon footprint, but it's also about material footprint, right? Which also has a big impact. So non-carbon related pollution, plastic pollution in oceans, for example, which also has an impact on, fishery, on human health, and so on the overuse of renewable resources, including water, and obviously things like biodiversity loss. And there has been a lot of, a carbon obsession in many ways that reflects particular priorities of Western nations that have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but also in the use of green industrial policies, right? It's kind of only focusing on the carbon side of things. But there's a big role in terms of material footprint and and this is where the overconsumption side comes in. I'm not particularly, I don't particularly agree with a lot of the degrowth agenda, but one thing that I think that they explain a lot better than the rest is that the challenge is not just one of carbon footprint, but the material consumption, right? So if you have, and sometimes they can work at the expense of one another. So you mentioned electric cars, right? And all that waste, right, that is there, even if it doesn't have a carbon footprint, which it kind of has, the material side is equally problematic. So this is the consumption side of the story. But for industrial policy, it's a very uncomfortable discussion because the logic of industrialization in general is to produce more, right? But then it has what we really need is a rethinking of the economics of product durability, which there is surprisingly scant literature on. Because obviously there is the side on the environmental upgrading that if you produce a more durable good, that maybe you have a market premium, but at the same time, there is that joke that the tire making company that produces a tire that never wears out is a company that will go bankrupt, because no one will come back to buy their tires because they just needed to buy it once. And here is a lot of tension, but it's also a source of opportunity for new type of green industrial policy, especially for latecomers. An example is in many parts of Europe or in the US, when you try to repair something, it's becoming increasingly difficult, right? If you take your laptop or your phone and try to repair it, even if it's just the screen that has a little something, they'll tell you, no, you have to buy a new one, and this one, kind of goes to waste. But in most developing countries, in Latin America, in Africa, you try to repair anything, people can get it done, right? And this kind of whole logic of repair, reuse, and for example, in areas of Ghana and Tanzania, they've actually built very strong capabilities in auto parts, reuse, repair. And this is a way to do green industrial policy that actually helps with the kind of overconsumption side of things. And same with the water challenge. It's a huge, huge issue. But based on existing challenges, there is room to disrupt, to innovate for example, more water-saving technologies. And those things are highly political, by the way. Mariana Mazzucato always makes the case that innovation is political. And it's absolutely the case, right? It reflects particular interests. If it's not in the interest of the incumbents to have water-saving technology because water droughts is not the issue for them, there won't be many resources going for it, right? But if it's an issue for Mexico, it provides this push, right, towards solving this issue. And on water, I think an interesting example of this kind of challenge-driven innovation is from Cuba, where because of the embargo, they could not access the standard product and chemicals that the standard product that you use around the world to wash kettle, to take off those sticks, right? Is that how you would call it? Those insects that basically suck blood from cows and that bring disease. Because those products had a lot of chemicals that are banned as per the embargo. So the Cubans developed this protein, right? And that essentially enables to neutralize the ticks. And for them, it was a challenge. They had to come up with something because they could not access the product. But as a result, their innovation is actually much more water. It saves a lot of water because suddenly you don't need any more water to wash your cows. So that Cuban invention is actually much better than what we have around the world, but came from a particular challenge that they had to address. But this won't happen if your industrial priorities are still determined by what goes on in your bigger neighboring country, right? Because then you have to align with what they see as strategic priorities for their economies or for their consumer demands, and not from a national point of view. Then there was a question about markets. Just to make sure, I'm not against markets, but I think that market-based mechanisms need to be accompanied by more proactive tools, regulations, to ensure that you reach the outcomes desired. An issue with market-based mechanisms is that they are necessary in many ways. So the question is, are they sufficient, right? So they also, even if they work, even when they work, the whole question is, how long does it take to actually solve the issue? And Ha-Joon Chang says that necessity is the mother of invention, right? So, and one way is to incentivize actors to reduce their pollution. One way is to put a very strong regulation to make sure that everybody has to stop doing a particular thing by a given year, right? And combining these two can be quite efficient. And I'll just give you one example that shows this logic from the EU. One of the great successes is with LED lighting, right? Which is a lot more energy efficient than incandescent bulbs. Yeah, this is LED lighting. But LED bulbs were too expensive, right? 15 years ago. And they were there. And what the EU did is that they, instead of a market-based incentive, they introduced a regulation, a gradual phase-out of incandescent bulbs, right, by a particular year. But with a clear target in terms of, it was a gradual phase-out. And as a result, it increased demand for LED lighting, which was still too expensive. But as demand increased, LED bulb manufacturers became more cost competitive. Then they became at a lower cost than incandescent bulbs. And by the end of the program, you didn't even need the regulation for this to be market available. But this is a clear example of regulations creating and shaping markets as opposed to just following a market-based logic.
Great. So we still have 7 minutes. Is there any more questions?
Hi. In relation to your answer to the previous question, well, we have another example with lithium, as it was a more efficient battery than the one previous to that. And so as demand for lithium increased in the market, technology got cheaper and etc. But how do we tackle the issues that arise from the excess and, well, overconsumption of lithium batteries that present today in Peru, for example?
Yeah. That's a very important question.
I don't want to be greedy, but you mentioned that industrial policy is heavily reliant on the political economies of the countries within which it happens, right? And industrial policy has been limited in countries like the US, or I think that there's another few examples you gave with industrial policy end up being elite, enriching, and potentially limited in its effectiveness. And that's down to a lack of autonomy of the state from powerful actors which have interests in things remaining broadly similar, right? So it's a political question. So what political suggestions, proposals are you making to create those political spaces, those social alliances, movements that would make genuinely impactful and effective industrial policy possible? Because that's the big one, right?
Yeah, that's $1 million question.
Yeah, so please tell us.
Yeah. Any other? Okay, so on the lithium question, this is very important. And I think that really reflects this tension between the carbon footprint and the material footprint, right? Especially of lithium mining. The big issue, and there's been a few studies on this, is there enough lithium in the planet to actually meet the needs of electrifying all vehicles? One is how far we're willing to go. There is now a growing discussion, and it sounds pretty scary, on mining in the seabed, right? So deep sea mining, and these kind of things that, you know, whether it's a good idea depends on a lot of things, information that we really don't have yet. There is a whole discussion whether it can be recycled, right, over time. But broadly speaking, the ecological damage is there, but it's not carbon related, but it's a material footprint problem. Now, in terms of mining, and lithium particularly, there is this great research that by Tea Riofrancos and her associates, showing that the challenge is not so much about replacing one type of battery by another, but really reconceiving the way people move and engage, and actually public transportation. And she actually shows the lithium mining needs for electric buses versus electric cars. So if you have to kind of have different scenarios in different cities in the United States, and it's incomparable, right? So clearly it's about, and it's not the thing as, oh, this thing uses mining, is terrible for the environment, right? But actually thinking, how much are we willing to, you know, use of that mining material to achieve our needs? And if there is a better way to do it, like, you know, increasing public transportation, electric buses, that seems like a much more reasonable option than, you know, replacing just one type of car over another. Talking about types of cars, you would know an electric car is only as clean as the electricity matrix of the place where it's being used, no? Because you have to charge this battery. So there's also research showing that if you drive an electric car, I assume in a place like Mexico City or in China, it's actually arguably worse for the environment, because you're still burning fossil fuels when you charge your car battery, but on top of it, your car required a lot more minerals to be able to produce the battery. So this is kind of those types of trade-off that require holistic understanding of what's green in green industrial policy. And by the way, green industrial policy is not always green, right? So that's the kind of understanding what are the objectives and specific needs of a particular country. A little point on transportation and talking about cars. This is also where there is a lot of how to say, that links to the political economy question, but the public perception of what is an environmental friendly solution over another is highly political, but it also reflects particular business interests. For example, I assume that we've all heard that air travel is bad for the environment, right? That if you take a plane and the carbon footprint and so on, we've all seen carbon footprint calculations at the individual level. But the whole idea of a carbon footprint, and as a result, the idea that air travel is bad for the environment, was basically a campaign in the 1990s sponsored by British Petroleum. And this was a way to set attention away from the ecological impact of oil companies towards individuals, right? And this was the concept of the carbon footprint, right? That you have a carbon footprint, so therefore, don't just blame BP, you know, you have a role to play in this as well. And same with air travel. So it's kind of fresh and radical rethinking of what is actually sustainability and what kind of industrial policy tools can help achieve both development and sustainability is needed. And on the political question, you asked that this is the big question, to which not only I don't have an answer to, but it's not for me to have an answer to, but the point I'm making is basically how to the different varieties of green industrial policies based on existing political conditions and social coalitions, right? In one way in which how to be adaptive to particularly interest groups when those cannot be changed is more of an explanatory fashion as opposed to thinking about how to reconceive existing social coalitions, right? But one factor that is important is public opinion, right? The strength of those coalitions is also dependent on public perceptions of the issue. And this is something where governments have not been particularly good at communicating in terms of what is the outcome that they want to achieve with green industrial policy. A big issue is that this is a really long-term plan, right? It's not something that you can achieve in 4 years. In Latin America, most of your governments last 4 years. So here, public communication is particularly important, right? To sense, and and dialogue with different groups, civil society organizations, to make sure that this is a direction, a target that is not really anchored in one political party, one government, but this is a kind of societal aspiration, and then kind of deciding on how to get there. I think civil society also has a big role to play that has been completely neglected in the discussions around industrial policy for the past century. One reason is because mostly it has been implemented in totalitarian regimes, right, where there's no need for industrial policy, you can decide. But in democratic societies, it's very important that civil society has enters the industrial policy debates, which it usually doesn't. But that's not only to act to raise awareness regarding the benefits and limitations of those policies, but also to be an effective watchdog of whose interests are being reflected in those type of industrial policies. In the United States, more and more they're playing this role after the IRA. I was really surprised in California. I thought that the IRA was great, that the Inflation Reduction Act of the US, everybody around me said good things. And then in California with civil environmental groups, they were just, oh no, that's terrible. It's a tax handout for big corporations. And they're actually raising this kind of awareness, this group. And I thought it was very interesting that who else than civil society can actually act as an effective watchdog and also represent particular coalitions, workers, labor, in terms of the design of those tools. So I know it doesn't fully answer your question, but I think these are some of the factors that can help build more transparent ways of pursuing industrial policy.
I think that we can finish with that.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Let me just, I think that we can finish with that. Let me express my gratitude to the audience for your attendance, for your interest and participation. Also to Boris for agreeing to comment on Amir's book. And we are deeply grateful to you, Amir, for agreeing to present this book, your book, and for trusting El Colegio de México for that. Thanks a lot.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Pues más o menos, no, estoy haciendo como una estancia de investigación en la CEDUA, pero soy de SOAS, la Universidad de Londres.
Ah, en SOAS.
Sí,
Ah,
sí,
bueno, yo
sí,
estudié
sí,
en
sí.
Inglaterra,
No, ¿dónde?
en LSE.
Ah,
Tengo un
perfecto.
artículo del